welcome back to another episode of Goodman Factory's podcast. Today we're touching on the subject of education. This is going to be part two. Part one was really popular amongst the audiences, and so we've decided to continue the conversation and sort of touch on some new aspects or alternative aspects that we didn't touch upon last time. So today I'm joined by Manny. So welcome to the show, Manny.
Thank you, bro. Thank you.
So obviously education is like it's always a sensitive issue, especially right now because of COVID. And as an educator yourself, I'm sure you see this sort of firsthand.
Yeah. Don't even know where to start, to be honest. This year has been mad crazy. So I work in a special school, and I work with children that have socio-emotional mental health. And so pretty much from the beginning of this whole pandemic, there's been an expectation that me and my colleagues will be in for the whole year round. I wasn't in for, I think, about 3-4 months because my wife was pregnant at the time. But literally, my school's been open the whole way through. So when people talk about schools being closed during this pandemic, it's not something that I can really relate to because my school's been open the whole time and education has kind of gone on as normal for our students. But with that said, I've seen the negatives of this pandemic on the lives of like the children that I teach in particular. And I don't think remote learning's worked for every child. And yeah, the year in itself has been really, really crazy, up and down. It's been lots of blessings for me personally, but I think from a professional point of view, it's been very challenging. Finding new ways to work, finding new ways to support students, but also staff as well. And, kind of preparing yourself for the tragic moments that happen. We lost a student. We lost a student last year, a number of months after the pandemic started. So it's been a difficult and challenging year, but I think education, regardless of what's going on, still seems to be an important topic and probably always will be. So yeah.
It's definitely one of those topics that I guess is spoken about, but particular angles are more popularized as a result of the media and the news and that sort of stuff. So like, you have the free school meals and all that kind of stuff. But then there are other aspects that don't necessarily get touched upon, and I think don't get the coverage that they necessarily need. One of the things that I found very interesting was at the beginning of the lockdown, because obviously I run an education business. I had like quite a few journalists and newspapers, the Independent and Telegraph, etc. They reached out to me to sort of write these nice little articles about 10 ways in which you can prepare your child for home learning and that sort of stuff, and which was cool and understandable. But then that was the last we heard about homeschooling and the whole concept of like how parents are unprepared for homeschooling, and we see it on a day-to-day basis with like family and stuff like that kids are expected to sort of just jump on these little calls with their teachers and stuff like that. And so it's interesting to me that you're still in school. How has the sort of learning aspect been disrupted?
You know what? For me personally, things have gone on pretty normal. Because I work in a special school. All of our classes are pretty small anyway. So the kind of planning that would need to go to kind of ensure that the school's safe, that might occur in a mainstream school, for instance, like shutting down particular classrooms or year groups, we haven't had to do. So things have kind of gone on as normal. So I will still teach the curriculum as I would have done before. I think the difference is that have to be sensitive around what's going on around the world. So you kind of like really want to focus on the academia side of things, but then there's also a real need to kind of focus on the socio-emotional aspects of learning as well. And obviously we have phases where children are having to remote learn, like, do remote learning. So even if it's just for a week, for instance, you kind of see the impact that has on the children, but also on their families. And so, understandably, there's kind of like a massive push to try and ensure that children with special needs or children that are vulnerable through different ways, trying to make sure that they're still in school so that they can still access the curriculum. And, you know, I work with children who have, I guess the common theme with many of them is that, you know, a lot of them have experienced traumatic early childhood situations or experiences. And so I think for them, it's really important for them to kind of be in school, because their needs sometimes go beyond what you can give them in the curriculum. Sometimes it's stuff like breakfast time, lunchtime, the social aspect of them being around other peers. You know, their targets are really focused around those things as much as they are around the kind of curriculum. So things have kind of gone on as normal for me, in the sense that, you know, my children still have access to the national curriculum, but that's because we're in school, and we can still be in school. So it doesn't change what I need to teach in terms of the core subject. So yeah,
it's interesting. I mean, to get into sort of SEN teaching is I guess there's many pros to it in terms of you being able to support young people and who with the experiences that they've had. What sort of got you into that to start off with?
Working with children with SEN. How did I get into it? Well, to be honest, when I worked in a mainstream school as a teaching assistant, I'm kind of like a journeyman in that I've had many different roles within education. Started off as a sports coach, then I was a teaching assistant before I then trained to be a teacher, and then I became a Senko. And so, you know, the common thing with most of my career is that I've always worked with children that have either SEN or that are disadvantaged or vulnerable, or both. And I think my first experience working in the first school that I worked in Tower Hamlets, although it was a mainstream school, the children that I was like assigned to or that I was asked to work with, first one was a child with autism, severe autism, so he couldn't speak. Communication, you know, was an issue there because he couldn't communicate verbally, so we had to kind of deal with certain behaviours that were not conventional, and that was a real learning experience for me as someone that had never worked in a school before. But I learned a lot, and it was really eye-opening. And then I think the next experience that I had was a little bit different, but still the child had ADHD with some behavioural difficulties. And I worked with that child for about 2 years, and I saw the impacts that I could have on that child, but also how that kind of like flowed into like the community and their family. You know, I was able to kind of like...
Do you mind me asking, like, with the child of autism, what was their background?
Their background, they were where were they from? It was an Eastern European country. I just can't say for sure. I can't remember.
Because the reason why I'm asking that is because I want to know. I mean, it's difficult in itself to sort of connect with a child who has who's on the spectrum in general. But like, is that something that sort of plays up on your mind, or was an issue the fact that the child may not have been able to connect with sort of the background and the home life that he's experienced?
I guess the short answer to that is no. It didn't really... I didn't think about it. I mean, at the time I would have been maybe 21, 22, fresh out of uni. Most of the experience that I had with young people, I think it was successful, whether it's through coaching or through tutoring, because I just built a relationship with them, and I was prepared to kind of be understanding of their needs or their backgrounds or their, you know, context. So to say it played on my mind or it was something I was thinking about, no, not necessarily. It's interesting that you even asked, because it's just making me wonder, you know, if that kind of contributed in any way positively or negatively. But honestly, I can't say I really thought about that at the time, and I'm not sure it had a massive impact on...
I think the thing that I'm sort of interested to know is, does image, in the case of like a child who has a certain learning difficulty or whatever, does the sort of connection of race or the connection of sort of that emotion? I mean, I'm guessing they would have grown up in a family that's Eastern European, or if it's an Asian child with an Asian family, and sort of when it comes to a teacher being different. Perhaps that's a positive, or perhaps it's a negative. But to me, it's a really interesting dynamic to see, does that play a role, or is it just irrelevant?
I mean, I can give you two examples. So with the first child that I worked with, that child had autism. They came from an Eastern European background. The child was non-verbal. So if that child did have an issue, you know, maybe some of their behaviors, they were communicating that, but, you know, obviously I wouldn't have never have heard that from the child from their own lips. However, it was never an issue that I can remember, but, you know, their parents, for instance, could have had an issue with the fact that maybe someone that's unfamiliar to their, I don't know, to where they come from, or someone that's different from their background. But I never got a sense of that. The flip side of that is the second child that I worked with that kind of really played a significant part in my decision to get into education, like properly full time, was a child who had ADHD, like I said, but he came from a Black Caribbean family. And I did see the positives of them being able to relate to me as a young Black man, but also as a young Black man that was raised in a similar neighborhood to them, and had many experiences like them, like his older brother, like the family. So definitely race plays a part in it, but I think particularly with education and most public sector jobs, or jobs where you're dealing with people, I think the key thing is being able to develop relationships between people, because I think the one thing that we all have in common is that we are all human. So I think when you treat people how you would like to be treated, in the ideal world, the quality of service that you give is the most important thing. You know, the empathy, the love that you show. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. But in terms of the children that I've worked with and their families, I haven't seen my race or my background be a problem.
But then on the flip side to that is you've seen sort of the positive side of it. And obviously when we look at things in context, and historically we've seen all these reports and sort of the data that comes in with young Black Caribbean boys being sort of low down in the rankings and low down in the sort of the numbers of them that go to uni, or the numbers of them that get into certain levels of uni. That then sort of lends itself well to like having somebody like yourself who can actually have a real direct impact firsthand. Do you think enough of that has been done? Do you think there's enough of these role models, or do you think we're making it too gimmicky and we're making it an issue when it's not an issue?
No, it's a good question. Something that I'm quite passionate about, talking about representation. I think it's certainly not gimmicky. I think when you look at the statistics, the data that shows, you know, Black African Caribbean boys being excluded at alarming rates, attainment not particularly great, and this has been the case for decades, for years. I think one of the things that I can identify that is a problem within the education system is the lack of Black teachers, the lack of Black male teachers. You know, if you want to go even more detailed than that, the lack of Black male primary teachers. I think as Black educators, we make up maybe 2%, I think, of the teachers' workforce in this country. And if you look at the amount of senior leaders within education, the numbers are, you know, alarming. You look at it and you think, wow, across this whole country, there's only a certain amount of head teachers that are Black. So I don't think it's gimmicky at all, because I think, you know, it matters to see people who look like you, who can represent you, who can be an advocate for you, who can relate to you, whether it's from a senior leadership point of view, or whether it's from just your class teacher, or even if it's just a TA. One thing I never had growing up was a Black male primary teacher. Finding a male teacher in the primary school was quite rare anyway. I probably had one that I can think of. But then finding a Black or an Asian one, for instance, was even, it never happened. I didn't have one. It's a very female-dominated sector, particularly in the primary department. So it's not gimmicky. I think one of the things that I think would contribute to supporting and helping and changing things for our Black students is having more Black role models and more Black male educators, particularly in the primary department, because, you know, as someone that's worked in the primary sector for like almost 10 years now, the thing I love the most about being a primary school teacher is that children are like sponges. You know, when you're teaching a child from the age of like 15 to 11, you know, they're like sponges. They soak up everything you give them in terms of the quality of education that you give them, the time that you give them, the nurturing side of it. And then I think what happens is it gets lost a little bit in the secondary, world. You know, the minute they start in year
I see a
7.
problem with that though. I do see a problem with that.
There is, yeah.
Yeah, and the problem, and I see the problem with it on a primary level and secondary level, and my problem with it is that obviously, like you said, children are like sponges, and they, you know, absorb whatever you're giving them.
Mm-hmm.
But then, if we look at it as those individuals that are giving them this information are in a system that they don't fully understand yet, and they don't fully understand how to navigate. The educators, the black educators, because they themselves went through the inequality. They themselves don't know the ins and outs of the game. And I know this from firsthand, from like interviewing tons of people across academia. And but by that, what I mean is, for instance, a white kid who goes to a school in a nice area is equipped not just with like better education, because that's questionable in some cases, or in many cases. What they're equipped with is, one, a sense of entitlement, that you're entitled to like apply and get into Cambridge, and you know all these kids around you have got into Cambridge or got into all these private schools, etc. But two, the schools make a deliberate effort to sharpen up their applications, educate them on their applications. What do they look for? What do these schools look for? Your extracurricular activities, what they should look like, etc. So there's an in-depth preparation for this child. Now, if you go back to this child, that's this Caribbean boy who maybe 10, 11, and then, you know, has had maybe one or two black teachers, and they're the ones that they connected with the most. Let's assume that they connected most with these two teachers. These two teachers don't necessarily have this information or know the ins and outs of the dynamics and the power interplay of the education system. So the two teachers have given them all they know, but not all that the kid should know to be able to navigate this, you know, this power. So that's a kind of issue that I see with it in terms of the structural inequality of education. So
I think that's key though, what you said though, the structural part of it, because it isn't the responsibility of that one or two teacher out of a teaching staff of, let's say, 100 staff members to give them what you've just said, schools, a whole school, a community, you know, would give a particular child. And I think that's sometimes the burden that, you know, being a black educator you might have. It's a burden I'll take on proudly, but that's why my gripe, my issue is with the education system, because the type of education that you just explained now, what I see, that's intentional, that's purposeful. You know, children that go to a particular school, like you said, they're trained, they're educated, not just with the academia side of things, but how to be able to speak, how to be eloquent, how to prepare themselves for debates at the parliament. They are the ones that get those jobs. So all of that is intentional. Whereas you look at, let's say, the typical, you know, mainstream local authority schools, they're not intentional with those type of things. That's not a focus, you know. Careers isn't even necessarily. But
that's my point, focus. Though. That's the point that I'm trying to get
to. It's
the
school's responsibility.
Is that yes, we understand that, and I'm sure you've understood that for a long time, and we've all been aware of that, and aware of that, and you know, like people like Akal have spoken, you know, extensively about this sort of stuff. But my point is, if we know this and we've been aware of it for, let's say, the past 5 years, it's been in the conscious part of our minds, and you know, we're able to sort of contemplate it and discuss it. If that's the case, then should it not be then our responsibility to sort of set up community organizations and make it deliberate? Because at the moment it's 100%. Not deliberate. And say, for example, you should have like a Caribbean. I'm just throwing this out there, but supposing a Caribbean male sort of
supplementary school.
No, just a community of teachers where, you know, you can talk about, okay, we need to do this and we need to do that. Maybe get the community at large involved. But then here's a question that a Caribbean friend of mine threw at me. He was like, we no longer have that sense of community that we once did?
Yeah.
So how much does that community aspect play into it?
It plays a massive part in it. Because a school in itself, for me, is the hub of a community. a school that's at the center of a community, the children that come out of that, they're going to serve that community, or they're going to tear down that community through the antisocial behavior that they're doing. So the community part of it is key. There's an African saying, I'm sure many of us have heard this before. It takes a community to raise a child. It takes a village to raise a child, not just the one person. And so one of the things that I'm, currently looking into, and that I'm really, really intrigued to kind of understand more, is how supplementary schools, particularly like in the 70s and in the 80s and some parts in the 90s, how that really kind of had a positive impact, not only on the identity, but also on the career trajectory of the students that went to those schools, the progress and the attainment. I'm genuinely intrigued, because I think it's something that, especially with the black community, I think we need to get back to. We have to really take responsibility for our children's learning. I think people that have heard me speak before, I often say the same things, in terms of like education failing, particular groups. And it isn't just black, African, Caribbean boys, but that's the one I'm going to focus on, because that's the one I'm most passionate about, because that's what I identify as, and I've been failed by that system myself. So the thing that I don't want to do anymore is keep talking about how the education system has failed our students, our children, and think about the solutions. And one of the solutions that, has been on my heart for quite a while now is setting up schools that will cater to the needs of our students. Because if not us, then who?
So now that you're sort of discussing this, which is something that I'm sort of inclined to discuss, and it's something that I work on a day-to-day basis. I'm sure Dami will tell you, and it's something that Dami works on with me as well. Looking forward then, because we've looked back, and tons of people before us have looked back and pointed out the problems. Looking forward, yes, you want to set up these schools, but we need a real tangible sort of structure, a real tangible idea. So if we're going to go down a route of supplementary schools, or like home learning centers or something along those lines,
alternative provisions, whatever they want to call it,
like however you wanna sort of deploy the actual education, what participants would you need to help you push that forward?
Good question. I guess it depends on what stage you're looking at with this. I think in terms of the planning stage, so let's say in the case that I want to set up a school, for me, the people that I want around me are the people that share the same principles and values that I have. I think that's key. But then I think what you then need is you need people who can plan strategically in relation to education specifically, because the idea of setting up a school, I know it's a lot easier to do that now compared to what it was like 10 years ago, but there are a lot of things that need to go into it. I think, most independent schools have started off, or a lot of new schools that have been created have started off traditionally as charities, and then they develop into independent schools, free schools. And so there's a lot that goes into the process, the people that the network of people that for instance, the relationships that you can build with people within the local authority. It's key, because essentially it's the local authority that will be sanctioning a lot of the decisions that you want to make. If you have a local authority that are not too keen on independent schools within that area, you already know that you're going to be having a problem there, even just trying to introduce the idea. Whereas if you've got a good network of people, or people that can actually look at you and vouch for you and say, you know what, I've seen this person. So let's say for me, I've seen this person as a practitioner, as an educational leader. I know that they're a man of their word. I know the kind of work that they could potentially do. This is something that we're prepared to sanction. So that's kind of one thing you need to look at, having networks and creating those relationships with people that are essentially going to give you the permissions that you need to set up something like that. But then in terms of like actually building it from the ground up, like I said, you need people that have the same principles and values as you. But then you need people that are going to be very skilled in terms of the finances. I wouldn't necessarily say business management is my forte. It's not my skill set. So I would want people around me that would be able to help me plan the financial aspect of things. A normal school now, for instance, in a year might get anything between 3 to 4 million. You know, how you use that money, you're not going to get that when you first start a school, but I'm just saying a normal typical school, there are people that you don't see at board level that are really thinking about how is this money being spent, you know, what is our budget, and then what is our predicted forecast by the end of that financial year. And that's key, because how you spend 4 million in a year is crucial. You've got things like pupil premium that you need to think about. Children are on free school meals. About 70% of those finances go towards staffing, teachers. Then you need to think about the curriculum. Then you need to think about the training for the governors. So one thing that I would do in the practical sense is I would get people who are highly skilled in those positions, whether it's people that can create policies, because it's another key factor of what you would need in a school. So policy making, the financial side of it, you know, having a business manager. And I guess the easy kind of answer to it is, you know, especially if you're starting off small, the one thing that is crucial to positive outcomes for young people, two proven things, is the quality of teaching, essentially, and good leadership. And so whether you've got a school of 10 students, because, you know, many schools might start off with just 10 students. If you haven't got excellent practitioners that are really going to educate those students, and when I say education, I mean like a wholesome education. I'm talking about, key subjects like, you know, English, maths, but also understanding the socio-emotional aspects of learning, you know, developing the whole person, having a real holistic approach to the type of child that you want to then have operating in your society. That's key. Excellent teachers are the ones that get schools great results.
Now, one of the things that we can't seem to get away from in this conversation is the essence and the need for community. Because what you've described is local authority, business, finance, practitioners, policymakers. So that
trusts, like fund people that are going to fund it. The whole thing.
Funders, money. So basically, essentially what you've described is people from across the board who would sort of are part of the community, are part of your community as the person that would set this up. And so one of the things that I love, and me and Dami talk about this all the time, and, you know, Dami's, you know, set up this, him and his partner have set up Goodman, and they've been doing an amazing job with it, is we know the difficulty and we know the ins and outs of sort of starting something. It's incredibly time consuming, difficult, lots of obstacles and stuff like that. When you're starting out off small, when you're starting off without a community. However, in the case of education, because there's so many stakeholders, it doesn't need to be that way. And so what my point is, and what sort of I'm trying to present here, is why don't platforms like this, like the Goodman Factory podcast and other platforms, put out this message and say, actually, we're looking for a business, you know, mind, we're looking for a finance mind, we're looking for a funder, we're looking for this and we're looking for that, and get these people together. Because like there's this thing that we're so accustomed to do in our generation, and I guess we're conditioned to do, is to expect somebody to do it but nobody does it. And so moving forward, now we have, you know, we have media, we have technology, we have all these things, and people are within reach. What's stopping people from doing it?
There isn't stopping anyone from doing anything. I think we've seen that. I think it's a good question. I think ultimately it comes down to, what do people prioritize? You said, you know, why doesn't like a company like Goodman Factory, but we're not specifically saying Goodman Factory, but an example of, you know, these platforms or these businesses that, you know, are on platforms and they have, you know, good exposure, positive influence, you know, they've got a good reach. Why don't they do it? At the end of the day, they're business owners, and unless their focus is specifically on education, the way it is for me, it's not going to be their priority.
No, I mean the fact that we're having this conversation on the Goodman Factory podcast, that in itself speaks to the fact that there's interest in this and we're moving it in the right direction. But one of the things that is more sort of, I guess, it resonates with me a bit more. I having been someone that worked in the education business for the past, you know, 5-6 years of my life, is that it just seems like not enough voices are there to support it. Because like we keep talking about, I mean, you mentioned that schools were the hub of the community. Now, the hub of the community, if that's the case, and we do have a sense of community, then the community should come together and say, okay, we do need homeschooling centers that are affordable for all our kids. We need, say, for instance, and for parents who don't necessarily want to take their kids to state schools, because we see the state schools as the only option. And that's part of the inequality that we face. So we've not necessarily taken power into our own hands. And I don't necessarily think we have the excuse anymore. Because before, we'd say, oh, we don't have enough people in the community that have the know-how. We don't have enough people in the community that are in positions to enable that. But now...
You do, yeah.
We do. So it's like, if you were to like push this forward today, if you were to sit down and say, okay, let me start off a school, or let me start off a homeschooling center, or let me start off an app, or whatever it is that you want to do, I still think there's resistance. I still think there is resistance from within our own communities.
Yeah. So that was an interesting one, because you have to ask, why would there be resistance, and who would that resistance be from? The parent of a child who's been, let's say, excluded from school, the parent himself has experienced, microaggressions from teachers, from school leaders, whatever it is. I can't see how that parent would then not be for someone who wants to set up, let's say, a home tuition center, or set up an independent school within that community. So for me, it's important to know who are those people that would be resistant against it, because you're right, they will be. Like, and now I guess we got to broaden the term, because when we talk about community, if we're just talking about black people, let's say, or black and brown people, well, we know that community is way too big to assume that everybody within that community is going to be on the same page, or understand the issues that other black and brown people have gone through. We know that. We see certain politicians who you look at and you think to yourself, how could you go on live TV and say what you just said, knowing how detrimental that would be for the people that you should be, or, you look like you represent, but you clearly don't represent. So you're right, there are people that are going to resist that. But who are we talking about specifically? Because that in itself matters.
Definitely, I agree with you. And when I say community, I don't necessarily I talk about our individual communities, because we all have our sub communities. We have our community at large that brings together someone like myself who's from Iraq, somebody like Caribbean, African. So we have like people from different communities, understand probably went through very similar things growing up and whatnot, but still have their own sub communities. And so, okay, in these sub-communities, supposing we go back to our sub-community level, communities that are in, let me not describe them completely as homogenous, but have a sense of tradition, sense of culture that is relevant, to one another. If we go back to that level, do you think you'd be able to sort of create some kind of buzz or some kind of movement on that sub-community level? Then that would pick up momentum. Or because you always excuse my language, but we all hear this shit all the time. Like, our own community would never do that for us, and we want to tear each other down. But that's not necessarily true, in my opinion, because that's just a colonized mindset where we think everyone's out to get us, and we step away from that emotional, natural human tendency to be gregarious and care for one another. So if we go to that sub community level, do you think that's a good place to start, or do you think that would create unnecessary tensions?
I think it's the best place to start. It's the best place to start, because it's, whether it's that sub-community or the larger community, whether that's like an area or a certain group of people, they are the people that you're trying to do this for. You're catering to them. So you want to be able to consult with them. You want to be able to reach them. You want to be able to have their involvement in it. And it kind of goes back to, what I said earlier. You can't expect other people to do things for you. if for instance I did have, or I do have this idea to want to set up a school, the people that I might need to go and speak to that will sanction it, that will fund it, that will say, yes, there's a building for you in this particular area, this site, we can, find out a way that we can finance this, blah, 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 blah. Many of these people might not look like what my sub-community look like. And so, you might refer to these people as allies, let's say. They might be for it, but they're not going to go out of their way to generate the buzz, to get consultations, to find out what kind of research, what do the people actually want. Because every sub-community is different. What might be a need in Peckham, for instance, is a different need from, East Ham. The general problem might be the same, which might be social deprivation, inequality, but what's specific to that community is specific to that community, essentially. So my point is that the sub-community, the community that you're trying to serve, are the most important people, because if I'm able to get, let's say, the finances, I'm able to get, the local authority to say, yes, you know what, we're up for this program or this project, how can we support you in that? They're going to want to know, what has the feedback been? Do the people want that? Is it a need, first of all? Are you just doing it for the sake of doing it? Have you actually done the research amongst the parents, the shopkeepers, the families that are, either suffering or going to benefit from whatever this idea that you've got? What are their voices saying? And if there's not a need for it, or you don't have the support, and when I say support, there might not be anything that they can give you from a tangible point of view, but if you know that people are interested in something like that, you can use that to your advantage. Whereas if people aren't interested in it, or they do not care, no matter how passionate you are for it, you're not going to get far, I don't think.
So do you think there is a demand for it?
I think there is, but I also think people don't know that it's something that they need. So how you asked before, how, would it be a problem, or is there likely to be resistance from some people? I think there's people in the middle who don't recognize that the root of the problem is maybe a lack of us having something for ourselves, us educating our own children, or us supplementing what's been done already in schools. Because, I work in a school, so let's not get it twisted. I'm not saying that schools are completely redundant.
No, absolutely not.
As a teacher, I know the impact I have in my classroom. I know the work that schools do. I know the work that individual people do within schools. But what we're saying is we're seeing a trend that's been happening for years. And the problem is the same. Yeah, so we're saying, what can we do to now solve that? And for me, I feel one of the things that hasn't been done over the last 10, 20 years, or what I've seen very little of, is our community, or my sub-community, taking responsibility now. And rather than just thinking these people are going to educate our children, they're going to give our children everything that they need to be successful, it almost becomes a bit naive now if you think other people are going to solve that problem for you. My parents even had that same kind of mindset, where they thought if they just sent me to school, things are going to be all right. And now when I'm getting excluded from school and I'm having issues with teachers and they're getting bad reports at parents' evening, they're like, what's going on? You've got free education. What's the problem? There's lots of problems in school, mum. But you don't understand it. You don't, and they don't understand it for different reasons. They don't understand it, one, because my parents came here as immigrants. So they don't have much understanding of the education system other than what's presented to them at parents' evening, or what I say or what my reports say. And that's one of the other things that I think is really important, is that parental engagement is key. If you have no idea what's going on in your son or daughter's life within the school, in terms of what they're learning, what they should be learning, what their expectations are for that child, even just the little stuff like their relationships within the school, if you're completely unaware of that, of course you're not going to be able to be the best support that you can be for your child. With that being said, I think it's really, really important to, I'm just trying to see how I can summarize it. Yeah, I just think it's really important for us to kind of take responsibility at this point.
It's a transitional era, in my opinion. Like our era, our generation is a very transitional generation, because I'm not here to sort of dunk on schools and say that schools are bad, etc. But like as with any research and development, and as with any sort of product that you have or service that you have to refine it.
Yep.
You have to improve it. Like there's nothing to say, that schools can't be better. There's nothing to say that the experience of young people from an ethnic minority, their experience can't be made better, or their, the outcomes for them can't be improved. And sort of like, I mean, for me personally, I interview academics on a day-to-day basis. I speak to maybe 5 to 10 academics a week. One of the things I've found just when I'm looking for academics to talk to is just go into any university, probably bar SOAS or something like that. Go into any university, go into staff directory, and count how many ethnic minority professors and lecturers you can find. You'll probably, per university, you'll be able to count them on maybe 1 or 2 hands. Like it's a very small number. Now, if you look at what that means, like it's not for me, it's not a numbers game. It's not, I don't care about like, oh, such and such is a white professor or whatever. But for me, it's the fact that as our communities, horizons are very limited. Like we don't know, there are fields out there that look at, for instance, like, I don't know, like supposing you have like family in Bermuda that are looking at ways in which you can improve the cultivation in Bermuda. Or there's research out there that is looking at Nigeria and looking at ways in which you can improve, experiences for kids with certain disabilities, etc. So to us, it's like, it was very linear. To us, like, you go to school, you become successful, you have a job, etc. We've all heard that before, but then there's so many fields that are not explored.
Yeah.
There's a massive world out there in research that most of our, like, none of us knew about when we were younger, but it's always been there.
Yeah.
We didn't go back to when we were kids. Not one of us had heard about Silicon Valley, but Silicon Valley existed. Not one of us heard about, technology companies and sort of technical disciplines, and they all existed. So my point is that when we look at these things, we're aiming to refine them. We're not trying to cause friction. We're not trying to like make noise and be, activists. What we're trying to do is we're trying to like refine the system, because ultimately the biggest beneficiary would be the country. Yep. You create an incredibly more productive workforce that is relevant, that can export better, that can, create better outcomes for the country itself in terms of GDP, in terms of, like GNP or whatever metric you want to use. So my point is, like, if we look at all these factors and improve them, we improve an outcome for everybody.
Society in general as a whole as well.
But the thing is, we are just not doing that. We're not looking at we're not sort of creating a roadmap for it. Without a roadmap, it's easy to evolve and stuff like that. But with something like education, you need some kind of roadmap, because that's how the evolution happens.
Some kind of strategic plan. Yeah, no, I mean, I can't really disagree with anything that you said. I think, like I said, it's got to the point now that we can't say that we don't know what the statistics are. Like, we've all seen the statistics. They've been the same since I was in school. We know the problems because many of us have experienced these problems ourselves personally. So when you ask, are people going to be resistant towards it? I don't think you will find much resistance within our subcultures. I think what you have is people being unaware of what the root of the problem is. And when you present it to them, you will get some people naturally that will kind of maybe sit on the fence or just be like, okay. They're waiting for you or for someone to at least prove it to them, to show it to them. But
don't you think that there's still this, remnants or like residue of this colonized mindset of like, oh no, if my child goes to Cambridge, he's gonna become something successful, and the likelihood of them becoming successful is high. Yeah. But why don't we make our own Cambridge? You know what I mean? Or why don't we sort of like change that structure?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that's the reason why I'm quite passionate about it. Not just because of the curriculum and how, I don't think the curriculum that we learn in our mainstream schools, I don't think it's by mistake. I think it's very much intentional. There's a reason why it's very different from the kind of education that students at Eton, for example, get. You know, like I said, it's purposeful. When they go to school, they know exactly what they're learning, why they're learning it, and they're practicing those things on a daily basis. And then they also have a community around them that helps them cultivate those skills. They also then have networks and actual, you know, like links to people that can then get them to where they need to get to. Sometimes irrespective of whatever their results are. You get it?
Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, since we touched on that, there's like some stats that I want to, and I'm not making this stuff up. This is like from a Cambridge
You got the book out. Go on.
You know what I mean?
I'm here
like,
for it.
Guy, 1,600 state schools. From 1,600 state schools, not one student gets into Oxford or Cambridge.
There you go.
1,600 state schools. Then you have, for example, Westminster School, which is like one of the public schools in the country, one of the elite schools in the country. They have more students going to Oxford and Cambridge than the whole of the country, the whole of the, sort of the pool of students who are on free school meals.
Wow.
So like these numbers are scary, and so like when we think about that system that we're still adhering to and thinking, okay, we wanna get into Cambridge, and then that it's basically we're just signing signing the contract to inequality. We're saying we're agreeing with this. And so like, how do we, like, obviously this is a tough question, and it's a very broad question, but how do we change it besides sort of starting our own stuff in the community or whatever? How do we change that? Do we target the government? Do we target policymakers? Do we talk to Cambridge and Oxford and say to them, oh, give us more rights? Or do we do something else?
I have to be honest with you. I'm at the point now where I don't want to go to anybody to complain about anything or to ask for anything other than what's going to help me solve the problem or do something different. I don't want to go to my school leader to say to him, can you change this curriculum? Can you do this and that? Because one or two things will happen. He or she will either agree or they'll disagree. Even if they agree, they're just one person. They could leave the job tomorrow. The next person that comes in, ultimately with the governing body, dictate what this school is going to learn, how they're going to learn it, blah, blah, blah. And so it's got to a point now where asking or begging other people to do what you need to be done for yourself or for your community is completely out of the question now. So as simple as it may come across, we really do need to set up something for ourselves. Now that may come in the form of home tuition centres. That might come in the form of setting up your own independent schools that can, you know, start off as charities. Could be as small as 10 students. It could grow and be as big as 50 students. You know, there's a guy that I've got the privilege of knowing called Ziggy Moore. He left full-time education in terms of the conventional educational teaching role, and he set up his own thing. You know, and he's having an impact on young people's lives. And a lot of his work is also how can he then support the families and the communities to grow something. And someone like him's in a position of great influence because he can really show other people how to replicate the same thing. And that's another thing we kind of have to focus on. When that one great school or that one great home tuition center opens, what we need to kind of get out of our mindset is thinking that we have this one particular hub of excellence or this school of excellence. It only works if it's the same everywhere else, if that makes sense. Because the only reason why the education system is so successful in failing particular groups is because what they're doing is the case everywhere, if that makes sense. What's happening in schools in Leeds, what's happening in schools in London or in Birmingham is generally the same in terms of the children that are being excluded, the type of children that end up in pupil referral units. So that's not by coincidence. It's been set up. It's being replicated everywhere. Same way all of the good, let's say, private schools, for instance, the reason why they're successful is because they are replicating good practice. You know, their curriculum, what they're teaching, the type of teachers they get in, all of that is intentional. So there's nothing stopping us from being able to do that. And I think one of the things that I won't say I'm concerned about, but one of the reasons why I wanted to research into like supplementary schools and why they were successful once upon a time is partly because I need people to be able. Sometimes people need to be able to see the data and statistic to be able to kind of prove to them that once upon a time, alongside mainstream education, or as a replacement for mainstream education, once upon a time, people were educating their own children within their communities, and these were their outcomes. These are what these children got from it in terms of the educational outcomes, in terms of them developing an identity, in terms of them having a support system or a network or having principles and values. These were the things that come from that. And I think the reason why people might be hesitant around that idea now, not just because they're ignorant and think, oh, if it's not Cambridge, then it's not going to be good enough. I think partly because they don't see those results. They don't see what that's looked like. You know, Akala, someone that I follow quite closely, he's an example of someone that attended one of these, and he talks very proudly about that experience. It massively, I wouldn't even say it changed his life, but it enhanced his life ridiculously. And he talks about it till today. And we don't think about that as being part of his education. We only think about what we would go to from Monday to Friday.
Of course.
There's kind of like a shunning of like supplementary schools. And so what's happened over the last 10, 20 years is we see less of them. You know, we had I won't say famous, but we had these supplementary schools that had massive reputations in like areas like Hackney, for instance, in Tottenham. How many of them do we see now? We don't see many of them.
That's really interesting because like I went to a supplementary school, but a Saturday school for Arabic that was set up by my dad, and me and my brother both like are testament to it because we learned to speak and write and read Arabic through that school, which at one point had 120 kids.
There you
go. You know what I mean? It's not a small number. And especially in East London where you wouldn't think that there's that many Arabs. There was loads of kids, and it was it was completely sort of community funded. We got some kind of like, you know, local grants here and there, etc. And it enhanced my education like exponentially. I can't. At the time, I wouldn't have said that to you because I'm thinking, oh, Saturday school and whatever. But now looking back, it enhanced my education exponentially. One of the problems, though, that I have, or not that I have, but the problems that I see is that supplementary, and this is something that I did an entire dissertation on, is supplementary education is costly. It costs money. So for us to be able to set these things up and bring them back and get the community involved and whatever, we need to get buy-in from the community. We need to get the leaders of the community to say, okay, I feel like I'm a stakeholder in this Caribbean community or in this African community or in this Arab or in this Asian or whatever community. I'm going to put up some money. Now, we don't want to be like the charity sector that 90% of the money goes into administrative costs and 10% goes for the cause. We want that money to go and to be used for the tangible benefit of these kids. So this is the only problem I foresee, is that do we have those willing contributors to say, you know what, I've got money? Because now we have people in all walks of life. We have, you know, BAME people in finance, in sports, celebrities, music, you know, like
every sector,
every sector you can imagine. We don't even have the excuse, but do we have the buy-in? Are they buying into this notion?
Well, you know, again, some people I think will only buy into it when they see the evidence or the proof that it's going to work. And I think that's the battle that I think you're going to face now, because we don't see many examples of it. Like you said, we've only really got like the one way of doing things. We send our children to school. We hope that we send them to a good school, like, for example, the new academies that's just been set up. But even those academies, you know, no shade on academies, but it's very much based on, you know, league tables, all of that kind of stuff. And you look at the numbers of children that are excluded or managed moved from these academies, and they're still high. And then you look at who are those children, and they are still the same working class, still the same particular groups that are being excluded from these schools or being managed moved now, as they like to say. And so what's happening is you've got better education for some students, and they're benefiting from this new way of doing something. But the ones that were failing in the mainstream schools or the normal local authority schools, they're still the ones that are failing. So I think for some people, they see like there's certain schools that have been built and set up, and they think that they're the answer to our problems. And in some cases, they've done some great work, but I still see much of the same problems. And, like, I'm massively passionate about it. I think it takes us to be able to kind of set up these things and have an understanding of those communities. If you've got people that do not understand the needs of those communities and how to be able to engage or be able to kind of like motivate or influence the people that you're trying to do it for, you're not going to get the results that you need. And I think that's what we're seeing in education now. We're seeing the same students that are failing or being failed every single day. So I think for me, the reason why people won't then start investing in something like that is because they need to see the evidence, the proof that it's going to work. And that sometimes is the problem, because when you haven't got the foresight to see something, that can limit you in many ways. But at the same time, I can't blame them, which is the reason why I would want to do some research, or at least to be able to find out on the impact of supplementary schools once upon a time. There are people like Akala that has spoken openly. You know, it's in his book. He's spoken about it on Instagram Lives, YouTube videos. This guy does talks at universities, and he says pretty much the same thing a lot of the time. His message doesn't change. And he talks about his experience of supplementary schools just the way that you did now, and how it enhanced his life and how it's made a massive difference to him. But how many people will watch that and still think to themselves, oh yeah, this is something that's beneficial? A lot of people still watch it and think, oh yeah, it's good for him.
Yeah, exactly.
No, it was great for him.
Yeah.
And there were other children that benefited from that as well.
In fact, not only was it great for him, it contributed to him being where he is today.
Of course.
You know what I mean? So it's like, I think the point that I guess we're both trying to get across is that there needs to be more people getting involved.
Just doing it.
There needs to be more people getting involved, and you know, like, there are fledgling fields now like education technology. There are fledgling fields like, you know, homeschooling centers, like Montessori education. Montessori education, which was once upon a time for poor people, is now exclusively for the elite. And so it's like, these things that are like, these things are there for the taking, literally there for the taking, and they can be financially very viable, sustainable. They can give you a much better life than what you would, you know, expect from anywhere else. So it's, you know, having that belief and just getting more people to take that step forward. Yeah,
100%. Yeah, everything you just said. So yeah, I mean, if you're listening to this and you're interested, I think it's time that we stopped complaining about it. Time we stopped talking about it, referencing it, and actually doing something that's really going to make a difference. And I guess, you know, the typical saying of putting your money where your mouth is, in this case, is literally what needs to happen. People putting their money where their mouth is, putting their time where it's needed, I think is key at this point. So yeah, come on, man, let's get these schools started. Let's get these supplementary places started. Hi, it's Manny from the Goodman Factory. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Hope you liked it. If you did, please make sure you like, share, and subscribe on all of your platforms, and also use GPod1 on goodmanfactory.com to be able to get discount codes. Peace.